Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. Clause 7 of ISO 22000, that is support. The Clause 7 support of ISO 22000-2018 is about the execution of the plans and processes that would enable an organization to successfully complete their food safety management system responsibilities. This is a very powerful requirement covering all management system resource needs. Organizations will need to determine the necessary competence of personnel working under its control, affecting the performance of food safety management system, its ability to fulfill its obligations, and ensure they receive the suitable training. In addition, organizations need to ensure that all people doing work under the organization's control are aware of the food safety policy, how their work may impact the food safety policy, and implications of not conforming to the food safety management system. Clause 7 also specifies about the requirements for documented information which relate to the creation, updating, and control of specific data. Clause 7 of ISO 22000-2018 has further 5 subclauses, which are 7.1 Resources, 7.2 Competence, 7.3 Awareness, 7.4 Communication, 7.5 Documented Information. Let's start with the subclause 7.1 Resources. The subclause 7.1.1, the general states that the organization is required to determine and provide the resources needed for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, update, and continual improvement of the food safety management system. Subclause 7.1.1 also specifies that the organization is required to consider the capability of internal resources, any constraints on them, and the need for external resources. Coming now to subclause 7.1.2, People. According to the subclause 7.1.2 of ISO 22000-2018, the organization is required to ensure that persons necessary to operate and maintain an effective FSMS are competent. Clause further states that organization is required to retain evidence of agreement or contracts as documented information defining the competency, responsibility, and authority of external experts. When the assistance of external experts is used for the development, implementation, operation, or assessment of the food safety management system. Let me talk about subclause 7.1.3, Infrastructure. This subclause 7.1.3 of ISO 22000-2018 specifies that the organization is required to provide the resources for the determination, establishment, and maintenance of the infrastructure necessary to achieve conformity with the requirements of the food safety management system. Subclause 7.1.3 guides under a note and says that infrastructure can include land, vessels, buildings, and associated utilities, equipment, including hardware and software, transportation, and information and communication technology. Coming to the subclause 7.1.4, Work Environment. As per this subclause, the organization is required to determine, provide, and maintain the resources for the establishment, management, and maintenance of the work environment necessary to achieve conformity with the requirements of the FSMS. The subclause provides guidance under a note in standard and specifies that suitable environment can be a combination of human and physical factors such as social, example, non-discriminatory, calm, non-confrontational, psychological, example, stress-reducing, burnout prevention, emotionally protective, physical, example, temperature, heat, humidity, light, airflow, hygiene, noise. Subclause also states that these factors can differ substantially depending on the products and services being provided by the organization. Let's talk now about the subclause 7.1.5, externally developed elements of the food safety management system. This subclause 7.1.5 of ISO 22000 says that when an organization establishes, maintains, updates, and continually improves its FSMS by using externally developed elements of an FSMS, including PRPs, the hazard analysis, and the hazard control plan, the organization is required to ensure that the provided elements are developed in conformance with requirements of this document, applicable to the sites, processes, and products of the organization, specifically adapted to the processes and products of the organization by the food safety team, implemented, maintained, and updated as required by this document, and retained as documented information. Coming to the subclause 7.1.6 of ISO 22000, that is, control of externally provided processes, products, or services. According to the subclause 7.1.6, the organization is required to establish and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring of performance, and reevaluation of external providers of processes, products, or services. The clause says that organization is required to ensure adequate communication of requirements to the external providers. Organization is also required to ensure that externally provided processes, products, or services do not adversely affect the organization's ability to consistently meet the requirements of the FSMS. As per this subclause 7.1.6, organization must retain documented information of these activities and any necessary actions as a result of the evaluations and re-evaluations. Let me explain the clause 7.1, resource in general. According to clause 7.1, resource, the requirements are to check that organization has identified which resources it needs to make available in order to ensure the effective operation of the food safety management system. Resources will often include raw materials, infrastructure, finance, personnel, and technology, all of which can be either internally or externally provided. Having sufficient resources is vital to ensure product and service conformity and satisfy customer requirements. Example, having adequate workforces, finance, and equipment to ensure timely delivery of products and services. Many organizations can run into food safety management system non-conformities as a result of insufficient or improper use of resources. The organization should identify the internal and external resources that are needed for the achievement of the organization's objectives in the short and long term. The organization's policies and methods for resource management should be consistent with its strategy. As part of its strategic planning, top management must decide what resources it must develop, acquire, or outsource to be competitive. Due to the ever-changing dynamics of the business environment, these resources and competitive advantages must be constantly upgraded or altered to enable your organization to maintain its competitive advantage relative to other firms. To ensure that resources such as equipment, infrastructural facilities, raw materials, knowledge, finance, and workers are used effectively and efficiently, it is necessary to have food safety management system processes in place to provide, allocate, monitor, evaluate, optimize, maintain, and protect those resources. Let us now discuss the clause 7.2, competence of ISO 22000-2018. According to this subclause, the organization must determine the necessary competence of persons, including external providers, doing work under its control that affects its food safety performance and effectiveness of the FSMS. The subclause 7.2 states that organization is required to ensure that these persons, including the food safety team and those responsible for the operation of the hazard control plan, are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, and experience. Organization must ensure that the food safety team has a combination of multidisciplinary knowledge and experience in developing and implementing the food safety management system. It should include the organization's products, processes, equipment, and food safety hazards within the scope of the FSMS, but organization should not be limited to it. The clause 7.2 states that organization must take actions to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken wherever applicable. Further, subclause 7.2 specifies that organization is required to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. Lastly, the standard through this clause 7.2 guides under a note and states that applicable actions can include, for example, the provision of training to, the mentoring of, or the reassignment of currently employed persons, or the hiring or contracting of competent persons. Let's come to the next clause 7.3, awareness of ISO 22000-2018. The clause 7.3 states that the organization is required to ensure that all relevant persons doing work under the organization's control must be aware of the food safety policy, the objectives of the FSMS relevant to their tasks, their individual contribution to the effectiveness of the FSMS, including the benefits of improved food safety performance and the implications of not conforming with the FSMS requirements. Let me explain this clause 7.3, awareness in general. Subject to the size and values of the organization, a wide range of approaches can be engaged for awareness of the food safety policy and objectives, from regular meetings, sessions, talks, notices, leaflets, and publication of food safety metrics to the inclusion and participation of individuals in cross-functional teams and improvement initiatives. Job descriptions, training records, work instructions, and minutes of performance review meetings are some examples not only of ways in which staff can be made aware of their specific contributions and implications of non-conformance, but also as documented evidence of such. Let's discuss about awareness training. Organizations do not need to conduct long theory sessions for awareness training. Training techniques can involve short training programs accompanied with tutorial videos and hands-on demonstrations that address key elements of the food safety management system. Communication via circulars, electronic bulletin boards, posters, and informational meetings are other procedures to promote and strengthen the food safety management awareness training. The requirements for general awareness training apply to all employees, including those whose work may cause significant impacts or food safety management risks. Awareness training is intended to provide an overview of the organization's energy policy, objectives and targets, and overall food safety management system. Organization must establish and maintain procedures to make its employees and members at each relevant function and level aware of the importance of conformance with the policy and the food safety management system procedures and requirements. It should also include the actual and the potential significant impacts and risks of the activities, products, or services. Awareness procedure should make employees aware with the benefits of improved personal performance and the employee's roles and responsibilities in achieving conformance with policies and procedures. Organization must establish and maintain procedures to make its employees aware with their roles and responsibilities towards emergency awareness and response and potential consequences of departure from specified operating procedures. Let us understand now the next clause, 7.4, communication. Let us start with an example. Examples of communication may include dealing with FSMS grievances or proactively inviting such stakeholders and responding to media inquiries, especially in the event of an incident. A failure to communicate effectively within initial few hours of an incident could seriously decrease the company's ability to control the situation. This will undercut the company's reputation in the minds of staff, customers, the media, and the public. Effective internal communications require mechanisms for information to flow top down and bottom up. Employees are often an outstanding source of information, issues, and ideas. Communicating with external parties is also significant for effective food safety management. Information from external sources can be critical in setting food safety management system and other business goals. The clause 7.4 requires the organization to have in place a system of communication that ensures that those within the organization are kept informed regarding the FSMS and food safety management issues associated with the organization's operations, and that communication from external interested parties is received and handled according to the established process. The function of clause 7.4, communication, is to support the achievement of the FSMS policy and objectives and the functioning of the FSMS in general. The clause requirement that information regarding the FSMS aspects and FSMS elements be communicated to personnel within the organization is intended to assist the organization in achieving its FSMS objectives as well as the commitments and overall goals expressed in the food safety policy. Employees who are fully informed of all the issues surrounding the FSMS and who feel included in the process are more likely to be motivated and committed to achieving the organization's objectives and targets and overall FSMS goals. Likewise, the limited requirements for communication with the external parties are designed to foster a more understanding and cooperative relationship between the organization and stakeholders, regulatory agencies, and FSMS groups. Communication of the food safety policy will also form an important part of internal communication, as a key part of the communication program will involve making sure that employees understand the food safety policy. In order to develop effective processes for internal and external communication, it is useful to have an understanding of what is encompassed by the terms internal communication and external communication and what the ultimate goal is of such processes. Let me start with subclause 7.4.1 general. According to the subclause 7.4.1 general, the organization is required to determine the internal and external communications relevant to the FSMS, including on what it will communicate, when to communicate, with whom to communicate, how to communicate, and who communicates. Subclause 7.4.1 states that the organization must ensure that the requirement for effective communication is understood by all persons whose activities have an impact on food safety. Let me explain now the subclause 7.4.2, external communication. The subclause 7.4.2 of ISO 22000 states that the organization is required to ensure that sufficient information is communicated externally and is available for interested parties of the food chain. As per this subclause, the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain effective communications with external providers and contractors. Organization is also required to establish, implement, and maintain effective communication with customers and or customers in relation to product information related to food safety to enable the handling, display, storage, preparation, distribution, and use of the product within the food chain or by the consumer. Identified foods safety hazards that need to be controlled by other organizations in the food chain and or by consumers. Contractual arrangements, inquiries and orders, including their amendments. Customer and or consumer feedback, including complaints. As per this subclause 7.4.2, the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain effective communications with statutory and regulatory authorities. According to this subclause, the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain effective communications with other organizations that have an impact on or will be affected by the effectiveness or updating of the FSMS. Subclause further specifies that designated persons must have defined responsibilities and authority for the external communication of any information concerning food safety. Where relevant information obtained through external communication must be included as input for management review and for updating the FSMS. Lastly, the subclause 7.4.2 states that organization is required to retain the evidence of external communication as documented information. Coming to subclause 7.4.3, internal communication. The subclause 7.4.3 of ISO 22000 states that the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain an effective system for communicating issues having an impact on food safety. As per this subclause, to maintain the effectiveness of the FSMS, the organization must ensure that the food safety team is informed in a timely manner of changes in products or new products, raw materials, ingredients and services, production systems and equipment, production premises, location of equipment and surrounding environment, cleaning and sanitation programs, packaging, storage and distribution systems, competencies and or allocation of responsibilities and authorizations, applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, knowledge regarding food safety hazards and control measures, customer, sector and other requirements that the organization observes, relevant inquiries and communication from external interested parties, complaints and alerts indicating food safety hazards associated with the end product, other conditions that have an impact on food safety. Clause 7.4.3 specifies that the food safety team is required to ensure that this information is included when updating the FSMS. Lastly, the subclause 7.4.3 says that top management is required to ensure that relevant information is included as input to the management review. Let us discuss the clause 7.5, documented information. The term documented information is meant to describe any information that is required to be controlled and maintained by the organization and the medium on which it is contained. Documented information can refer to the food safety management system and its processes, documentation and records. So in brief, it includes anything that organization requires to be recorded to make sure its FSMS functions properly and that organization can demonstrate that this is the case. In this, the requirements for documented information are captured and they are fairly basic. A document is information that is written or recorded on some medium such as paper or computer. A document may specify requirements, for example, a flow chart or technical specification may provide direction, for example, food recipes, or show results or evidence of activities performed, for example, customer feedback. The term documented information is used for all document requirements in ISO 22000-2018. The need to have additional documentation beyond those specified in this standard may depend upon compliance obligations, including regulatory requirements and your own organizational requirements. Other factors to consider may include the complexity of products or services and processes, type of activities, FSMS issues, significant food safety management aspects, economic risk, effectiveness and efficiency, the competence of personnel. This information is expected to be tailored to organization because it is noted that the extent of the documented information can differ due to the size of the organization, the complexity of the organization, and the competence of the people. The organization is responsible for determining what documented information needs to be retained, the period of time for which it is to be retained, and the media to be used for its retention. The requirement to maintain documented information may also include the possibility that the organization can retain that same documented information for a particular purpose, for example, to retain previous versions of it. Lastly, there are requirements for the control of documented information, particularly how it is available and suitable for use, it is adequately protected, it is distributed applicably, and access, retrieval, use, storage, and preservation are controlled. Finally, there needs to be control of changes, retention of documented information, and disposition when these documents are removed from use. If you look closely, you will see that these requirements are very much the same as those already in place for documented procedures and records, only merged into one set of requirements. Many people make the mistake of changing the definitions that they use in their management system to match those in the standard when this is not a requirement. The standard is not there to dictate what you will call something or even how you will number any document that are in your system. If you want to continue to use the terms procedure and record because this is what the people in your company understand, then go ahead. The requirements of the clause 7.5 of ISO 22000 standard are there to give you a framework to build a food safety management system that works the best for your organization in your effort to meet legal requirements and improve your service management performance. Now, let's talk about its subclauses. Clause 7.5 documented information has the subclauses as 7.5.1 general, 7.5.2 creating and updating, 7.5.3 control of documented information. Let's start with the subclause 7.5.1 general. This subclause 7.5.1 of ISO 22000-2018 states that the organization's FSMS must include documented information required by the standard. Organization's FSMS is required to include documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the FSMS. As per this clause, organization is required to include documented information and food safety requirements required by statutory, regulatory authorities and customers. Subclause 7.5.1 also guides and says under a note that the extent of documented information for an FSMS can differ from one organization to another organization due to the size of the organization and its type of activities, processes, products, and services, the complexity of processes and their interactions, the competence of persons. Coming now to subclause 7.5.2, creating and updating. This subclause of ISO 22000-2018 states that when creating and updating documented information, the organization must ensure appropriate identification and description, for example, a title, date, author, or reference number, and the format, for example, language, version, graphics, and media, example, paper or electronic. Organization is also required to ensure appropriate review and approval for suitability and adequacy of documented information. Let us talk about the subclause 7.5.3, Control of Documented Information. The subclause 7.5.3.1 states that the documented information required by the FSMS and by the standard must be controlled to ensure that it is available and suitable for use where and when it is needed. As per this clause, documented information required by the FSMS and by this standard must also be controlled to ensure that it is adequately protected from loss of confidentiality, improper use, or loss of integrity. Coming to subclause 7.5.3.2 now. This clause 7.5.3.2 specifies that for the control of documented information, the organization must address the activities as applicable, like distribution, access, retrieval and use, storage and preservation, including preservation of legibility, control of changes, example, version control, retention and disposition. Subclause further states that the documented information of external origin determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the FSMS is required to be identified as appropriate and controlled. According to this subclause 7.5.3.2, documented information retained as evidence of conformity must be protected from unintended alterations. Lastly, the clause guides and states under a note that access can imply a decision regarding the permission to view the documented information only, or the permission and authority to view and change the documented information. Friends, we have now completed the clause 7 of ISO 22000-2018. For more information about our institute and other training programs, you can contact us through email or phone. I sincerely thank you all for your interest and attention.